I used to be ashamed of my past and unsure if I'd make it to where I was going. But I knew one thing was for certain. We don't end up where we're going on accident. I've also learned that we can't erase the past or hide from it, but we can learn from it and pass it on to others. So who am I? I'm the definition of a bootstrap girl. Someone who's made the hard choices to pick themselves back up and make something of themselves. And I'm not the only one. My name is Danisha. I'm a mom, a wife, a professor, advocate, queen of my own path, who's overcome abuse, foster care, homelessness, and raising 5 siblings on my own at the age of 24. And eventually I got a PhD. But something that I learned is that I don't know everything. So here on my show, we're going to be bringing in people who know the things that we don't know. Let's get in and learn on the Dr. Danisha Keating Show.
I used to be the guy. I used to stand in front of the newscaster, and I would count down.
Did you really?
So cathartic. It was so cathartic. I don't know
Man,
why.
Okay, so I have Daniel here. So excited to have you guys back on the show. Daniel he just said he's a LinkedIn celebrity. It's really cool. He didn't say that, but it's just a lot of people he's very active on social media. And a lot of the things that he does is within telling your story in different forms. And one of the big forms is through camera. And I think that's something that a lot of us have forgotten. We were just talking about how, specifically within the foster care community, I have worked with a lot of people who are like, well, if it's not a traditional publishing, it's not real publishing. If it's not you getting picked up by an agent, you're not really an author, or really like you're not telling your story the right way. And I feel that we have forgotten all the other avenues that we can use, social media, which a lot of people are starting to turn to and go to. Documentaries, movies, writing your own book and self-publishing, podcasts, places, music places. Like there's so much. And now you were saying that you're the person behind the camera counting down. But one of the reason I actually first asked Daniel to come on the show is because of the fact that there was a conversation that he was having on social media when someone's like, you don't need to spend all this money to create like a film. And he was like, hold on, guys. So we're going to talk about 2 things today. We're going to talk about multiple ways to tell your story. I just pulled my hair. It's great. And when do we need to invest? Because I think what's really happening is that so many people that I have talked to, even when it comes down to a book thing, when it's self-publishing, they're like, well, I have to spend $15,000 over here, but Amazon is so much cheaper for their KDP program, and you're not spending $15,000. So some people get stuck and go, well, I can't self-publish because I don't have 15 grand. And it's like, well, you don't need it. But then there is moments that it's like, okay, when do I invest that kind of money in telling my story? So first, just dig in. What do you do? How do you do it? And let's dig into telling your story in multiple forms.
For sure. Loaded question.
Yeah, I know.
That has
I just dig right in.
Of answers. Yeah,
I love it. Take it away. I love that.
Yeah. So I think, the hardest story to tell, first of all, let's just take a little bit of a step back and think about storytelling itself, right? The hardest story to tell is often your own.
Oh, yeah.
It's often much easier to tell other people's stories and much harder to dig into your own trauma and your own triggers and things like that, right? And exploring yourself is, at least in my experience, much harder.
100%.
So a lot of that process of telling your own story is really giving yourself permission, right? Other people can give you permission. They can kind of push you. They can kind of encourage you. And that's a lot of what I do.
Yeah.
But ultimately you have to give yourself permission to dig in and do that. So that's kind of the first barrier that we come up against in trying to tell our own stories, our own kind of mental blocks and these emotions that start coming out as we dig in, right? And then once we kind of clear that hurdle, the next barrier that we come up against is, well, how do I do it? Right? What's the platform? What's the method? Is it writing? Is it video? Is it social media? What is it? Right?
Right.
I'm a big believer in start with what you've got. If you're a youth, or if you're a person who doesn't have $15,000-$20,000 to go out and produce a documentary, you don't need to do that right now, right? What you need to do is take out your iPhone and start recording yourself talking about some of these things, and start storytelling is a muscle. It's a skill. It's something that you have to learn and do to get better at. It's
Right.
not a thing that you're just going to instantly be great at, even if you have a lot of lived experience, right?
Right.
Because learning how to vocalize that and learning how to communicate that effectively is a thing in and of itself
Right.
that's kind of separate from that, right? So, um, you want to there's like these two sides. There's these two extreme camps when it comes to
Right.
this part of it, right? And this is where I get frustrated, where it's like on one side you have people who are like, it doesn't matter, you can do anything, just go do it, just go make stuff, like just go blah blah blah, blah. Like, you know what I mean? Like everyone is a creative, everyone is a storyteller, everyone
Not
is
true. Yeah. Yeah.
an artist. No, like, no, there's a process, there is a skill set, there are principles that matter that you
Right.
should learn if you want to tell your story through whatever medium it may be, right? So respect the process, educate yourself in that process. I'm a big
Yeah.
believer in that. But
Yeah.
on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are like, well, if you can't dump, tons and tons of money into it,
Right.
don't bother at all. That's the other extreme, right?
Yeah.
So we want to avoid the two extremes. Like most things in life, we want to be somewhere in the middle,
We
which
have
is
some
start again.
middle here.
Yeah, exactly. Start with what you have and build.
Yeah.
And if you build, say, a social media platform or a
Mhm.
podcast, which you can do very much as a 1 or 2 person team, that's the other thing I would recommend, is if you can build coalition, amazing.
Right.
Like, hey, if you're a foster youth and you have other foster youths that are around you that also want to tell your story, make your own little production team, right? And I'm going to
Yeah.
record and
Yeah.
you're going to edit and you're going to write and we're going to just do this thing, right? That's a great way to do it. That's how I started early in my career. Just a bunch of, people fall in and out, but that's how you get started, right? So build coalition, and make the thing. And then if over time you build an audience of whatever platform you're distributing through,
Mhm.
then you can say, hey, let's approach one of these bigger organizations, or hey, let's go try to raise some capital to do a bigger project, right?
Mhm.
It's about stair steps. I think sometimes the mental shift that's occurred in this new media landscape where things are a lot more accessible is people have just decided we're at the ground floor and like that is it. Right?
Mm.
Like we're just going to be on the ground floor forever. No, it's an
Yeah.
opportunity to get in, because it used to be, in the 90s or before new media, to get an opportunity to make something that people would actually see,
Right.
you needed either to be independently wealthy or you had to get
Mm.
through gatekeepers in publishing or the studio system or whatever.
Right.
Now you can get started on your own, but you should, if you want to do this long term, think about where is this ultimately going
Yeah.
and grow it over
Yeah.
time. So that's my big thesis statement on like
So
this whole thing.
I want to dig into this because there are so many points that you made that I'm like, "Yeah, I'm doing it right," but also like, oh, that was a little too early. So one of the things that you said was practice. I'm taking notes, like my pen broke down and I'm like, oh, but let me get my notepad out. So I pulled up my notes. So I'm off to the side here, so at a screen. But you said storytelling is practice, 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 practice. Because
Right.
one of the things that I have noticed after doing this for a long time is I'm able to pivot very quickly if I'm noticing something is happening in the room. And if you don't practice, you're too focused on what you're trying to say and getting through your PowerPoint. Like, and I mean, like, I have been in conferences where they're like, you have 2 hours. And then they come to me right before I go up and say, hey, we're running super behind. We got 20 minutes. And I'm like, how do you condense 2 hours into 20 minutes? And so it's like I have to be thinking on my feet. But also, I have been able to learn to practice the delivery of what I
Yes.
want put out there.
Yes.
And if I wasn't practicing, I would have said some things I didn't want to say. And I think that is very like there's some people out there who's like, don't share your story until, like you've crafted it. But I'm like, through learning how to tell my story, I've been able to craft it because I can walk away and go, ooh, that was a little too much. When I find that we don't practice, especially as someone who has experienced trauma, is I come in and I accidentally trauma dump. And that actually hurts the audience and they spiral because of that.
Right.
So by practicing, I can go, ooh, that's too much detail there. What do I want to produce out there that someone's listening to? What is the message that I want to give them today? And then I'm able to sit there and go, okay, how do I craft this more and more and more? one of the things that I'm like realizing is like my very first book, I'm self-publishing a third book now. And at first, I did get stuck in that mentality of like, oh, I'm not picked up by an agent, and all the woe is me things. I don't have all this money to spend, but self-publishing is really good. But I've noticed from the first book that I self-published to this one, I've gotten a lot better at staying on topic because I've practiced my writing. So you're like, start with what you have. And so I started with a blog that I do before I even started writing this next book. I was like, let me start blogging again to get into the habit of writing to stay on topic. Same thing with talking. If I'm going to go out and share my story, it's like, let me start practicing how I want this to come out, because one of the worst things that we can do, which I have been on the receiving end of, is sitting in a room with people and all of the audience going, what the heck was that? Like, oh my gosh,
scary.
like it is not great. And that's just simply, I think, because the person didn't practice, it was too early. And you brought that kind of up, is like, you want to do this at the right time. So if you don't have the right stuff, you can start, but as you grow, you should also grow your equipment. You shouldn't be on your phone for 7 years. Your content, I think this kind of, we have to talk about this, is like your content should also grow if you're sharing on social media, doing a podcast or anything like that, because it's really to your audience. If your audience is growing and you're not, they're kind of like, okay, I'm going to unfollow now, because you're still stuck in especially with people who share their trauma online, is you're still stuck in your trauma. And like, I'm growing out of my trauma, so I don't want to follow you anymore. But it's like, you want to show the growth. You want to show that you're in counseling. But I think with storytelling, it can get really murky of when we share too much of our trauma, and then when we share too much of the detail, it can actually lose people who are listening to us. So what would your 100%. Advice first be there about effectively sharing what needs to be known to understand the concept that you're trying to get to?
Wow, that is a very you're asking amazing
the deep
questions.
Ones.
I love that.
I like
that's
the
fantastic.
hard ones.
I struggle with the easy ones, actually. The easy ones are much harder.
Like, how's your day? You're like, huh?
Yeah,
Hold
right.
on.
What do you do for a living? Yeah.
Look, we're entrepreneurs. That's what I say. I'm like, we're a panora.
That's actually so on the subject of trauma dumping, I absolutely agree with you. I think that there's been so much storytelling, bad storytelling over the past few decades, especially, that have done a lot of harm and have exhausted people, and have made people kind of put shields and walls up, either because they have trauma that it's like activated, or just like, I'm just trying to unwind, man. Like, I'm not really, I don't want to go there. So that's a big part of understanding storytelling too, is who is your audience? Where are they at right now? Hitting them with the right message at the right time, right? There's a time and a place for that really in-depth, trauma explanation to come forth.
Right.
But it's not every moment of every day. That's too much. Your people will shut off, right? You gotta meet your audience where they are. You gotta think, like, when people open up their phone, or whenever they go to read something or watch a movie or a YouTube video or whatever it is, they are looking for a certain degree of entertainment. They are looking for a certain degree of education, entertainment. They are looking for value, right?
Yeah.
So you've already done a good job of that on this podcast, where you do a nice job mixing in some humor and mixing in some personality with these deeper questions.
I love it. Yeah.
So
thank you.
There's a lesson there for listeners, is like, you got to mix. There's a saying here in the South that, like, you got to mix the honey with the medicine. Right. So like, if you just give someone straight medicine, it's like, I don't want that.
Yeah.
But if you give me some honey, honey, and then the medicine goes down. Right. So that, again, that is a skill, that is a cadence that takes time to develop. And it's almost an instinctual, intuitive thing that you will develop. But what I would say is, don't be afraid to, like, bring joy into this. Like, we run a video podcast for a foster youth organization, and I would say at least 50 to 60% of the content that we do for them is joy, positivity, fun, collaboration, uplifting, right? at least. And then the other 50% is, you know, maybe deals with some of the heavier stuff.
Right.
But you need that mix. So, and what I would like to say is on the subject of kind of going back to the giving permission thing that ties into this
Mm-hmm.
is don't get too hung up on doing this stuff wrong, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think a lot of the fear that we carry about making content, and myself too, in my own content, the fear that we carry
Mm-hmm.
into making content is old fear from the old
Yeah.
days of broadcast and publishing and big
Yeah.
studios and big executives and all this scrutiny and all these layers of approvals that we think anything that we create is going to be this like forever and ever thing, right? And gonna have to please all these people. When you're just starting out
Mm.
and you're making your own content, and you're self-distributing everything, it's disposable content in the early days. You don't have a huge
Yeah.
follower base. This stuff gets lost on the internet backlog, right? Go look at
Yeah.
any of your favorite YouTube channels, any of your favorite creators. Scroll all the way to the bottom and look how rough it is for the
Yeah.
might be
Yeah.
years, might be literally years of just, oh my god, and then you'll see them turn a corner.
I
You'll
always
see
think,
that one video.
yeah, and they turn the corner, but I always think it's funny because as you start to dig into someone's content like that, just to see how, like, where did they come from? It's like,
Right.
it's not just their content that's whack. It's like their hair,
Yeah.
their clothes, like
Everything.
their makeup,
Yeah.
because you're literally just like, I don't care how I look. I'm just going to get on and do it. And then
Yeah. And that's the
see
first
what
step.
feels good. And that's where it's like, okay, but they don't delete it because they're just like, but that's where I
Right.
came from. And
Right.
I appreciate that because it's like, oh, it's not perfection. I started on my phone. And then I gradually moved from a laptop to an actual desktop, and then moved from a desktop Zoom session to a camera. And my
Right.
husband's like, you got to up your game this year. And I was like, oh, I do got to up my game this year. And but
Nice.
you look back and you start to see, you're like, okay, it wasn't super bad visually, but the editing wasn't the greatest. The captions weren't there. There was no real clip arts. Like, there just wasn't a lot that outside of the video that someone got. And now this year I'm like, okay, there's systems and things out there that makes my job easier to where I don't have to spend thousands of dollars to do this. But when it comes to the storytelling, I think when I want to clarify, because some people are like, but my whole life is trauma. If you're someone who has had trauma, there is a thing that, and I like that you said that, it's like, you got to give some honey with this. It's like, you don't want to whiplash them emotionally to where it's like happy, sad, depressed.
Yes.
But what happens is when it's 3 days in a row, 6 posts that you've done, and all of them is like, here's the things that have happened to me. What the audience does is that they disassociate from your story and they become numb. So it's like when what I didn't want to do, and this is something that I really struggled with Instagram. Like, I could put it in a book, I could talk about my story with people in person, but putting stuff like on social media, it wasn't a fear of doing it wrong, but it was like, how do I tell my story to where I'm not giving all the details of my abuse to people? Because it felt like I was just trauma dumping on them, but it also just felt like I don't want people to know this information. So over time, by practicing, and it's like, okay, did I like how I felt with that post? Like, not necessarily did it get a good response and likes and follows. You will grow if you come on and you're just like, here's all the crap that happened to me, and I hate this person and that person, and you spill all the tea because people like drama. But to stay longer, stay long term, this is you see those accounts grow, and then people start going, man, can you stop? Like, every single post you have is you're ragging on someone. Every single post you have is you are airing out your dirty laundry for the world. You're naming names, you're doing all this stuff, and then they don't see you as a person who can be trustworthy. Like, they're like, if I were to ever hang out with you in person, like, bro, like, I don't know if you're gonna post me online later. Like, that's the person, that's the environment that it seems like you're creating. So for me, it was like, I want a lesson to be learned. I don't care if it was my dad or my mom who did this to me. I don't care if it was a teacher or a CPS. I'm not naming names. And it was more about what I put out every single time is, I want you to see the situation, not the person who did it, not what happened, like, not how I am pissed off about this, but I want you to see the situation because someone in your life might be in this situation. And if I can teach you that lesson to eyeball what you're looking for, maybe you can go help someone in your life. And that was a huge shift where I started seeing my growth happen with social media. But it also can get very frustrating when I'm like, wow, that person who came in last year had like 100 people following him. Now they're like 700,000 people. But then I look at their
Yeah.
content and I'm like, oh, that's okay for you. You're cool with that. I'm glad you're cool with that. But what happens when that's no longer your driving force of your content? That I think is a big issue. So how, if someone
Right.
wanted to shift from trauma dumping online all the time, what are some things that they need to consider?
Well, let me start this by saying it's not my place to tell an individual
Right.
how they should feel about what they've experienced and how
Right,
they
right,
want
right.
to share it. I don't like, this is not me I don't want to come off like I'm passing any kind of judgment, because
There is
sometimes
no
these things just
judgment.
have to
It's
come
just,
out. Yeah.
yeah. And there's a difference between like, like share your story, share it the way that you want to. But if someone is struggling,
Right.
maybe they don't want to put that content out anymore because they're like, I'm
Right.
healing that person. Like maybe they're posting because they're literally trying to get someone to help them investigate the situations that happen to them. Totally get that. But now let's say 2 years from now where they're like, hey, this content is exhausting to put out because I just feel like I'm giving everyone everything and all I get back in return is negativity, bashing, and I
Hmm.
don't want to continue that content. That's where we're talking about. No one's
Okay.
bashing, no
Gotcha.
one's making fun, but just more of like,
Totally.
if I
Yeah.
wanted to shift or maybe even shift into starting to tell more intimate details of my story, what are some things we should be cautious of?
Here's what I would say, what helped me too, is start viewing your content journey as part of your personal development journey.
Mm.
The closer you can kind of mentally associate it, almost like with therapy,
Mm-hmm.
like with healing, then that gives you, one, a reason to keep going, but also
Yeah.
it gives you a kind of a positive reinforcement baked
Yeah.
into the creation process, where maybe you center it around like, hey, these are the things that I wish were in place whenever I was going through this.
Yeah.
Like, I wish these are I'm going to get out there and advocate for these systems or for these processes to be put in place. Or you know uh, how we deal with one another, cultural
Yeah.
issues, whatever kind of your the thing that you want to talk about and address and hopefully move the needle on. I
Yeah.
think if you can look at it from kind of a bit of a personal development angle, rather than like, I think sometimes there's a tendency to look at it um, as like people look at the follower counts, right? Almost like a
Yeah.
business decision,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And you can't really control that. That's one of those things.
Right.
There's ways to
People come and
gamify
go.
it, and
Yeah.
people come and go, and also like how many like there's also a big problem online of like bots, right? So
Oh yeah.
sometimes an account
Those
might
are
be
fun.
half their followers might be bots, right? Not even be human beings. You're making content for human beings, right?
Right.
Not robots. So you also have to decide for yourself, do I want to have a handful of engaged followers, right? Or do I
Mhm.
want to have a bunch of robots? Like, that's
Yeah.
a question. So I think to answer your question, I think the thing to do is to think about like, what do you wish that the person receiving this message, what is the
Mm.
value that you want to impart to them?
Yeah.
What is the lesson, to use your strategy? What
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
value that you want to give them, so that when they walk away from this content, they're a little bit enriched? And now it's not just
Yeah.
about you, right? Now it's not just
Right, right,
about, oh,
right.
me and my pain and my suffering. Now it's about somebody else, and that'll help
Yeah.
you grow, and that'll help you shift your mindset in the way that you talk about this.
Yeah, and there's so many like I follow so many different people who are sharing their story. I think really like that online, and their
Yeah.
accounts grow because it's no longer like, yes, there's still moments where it's like, hey, this is what happened. And I've like listened and I'm like, that's, as another person who has been on the other side of being like victim shamed or guilted or put down, I'm like, that's not okay. And I want to speak into that with you to say like that shouldn't have happened to you. You should have been received
Right.
versus rejected. But you see their growth and it's like, that's really cool to see. that someone out there is telling their story effectively. But it is something that to be cautious of is, yeah, it can be deleted. But I think the thing that I've come to realize is like, if I burned a bridge of 100,000 people, because I'm like, F the world, that's 100,000 people who like I hurt. And so what you're saying is like, what is the lesson that you want to teach the person on the other side who receives this? It's like, that is a different way of thinking. And that growth is going to be slow. But it is so funny that you mentioned the bots, because there was like, I posted something really like, hey, this is what happened, this was very sad, and someone was like, I love your perspective, it's such a beautiful thing, and the scenery behind you is gorgeous, or something like that. And I was like, this is not a real person, this is
definitely
fake.
a bot. Yeah,
Definitely. But it's like, you can't avoid those, but what you could do is just leave them, comment back, let your content grow from that. But don't engage with that account, because then you get a ton from experience. You get a ton of messages of like, we can help you grow. Like your reach isn't that great. You have, 40,000 people following you on Instagram and 10 people liked your post. And I'm like, that video was 20 minutes long.
Right.
Yeah. So that's going to have a lower engagement.
Of course.
And they picked the one literally in the middle of other ones at like 20,000, 30,000, 100,000. And I was like, you picked the one. Okay.
Yeah, of course. It's
but
so weird.
I like that you mentioned that. That's just something we need to talk about, is the bots.
Yeah, for sure. I want to also add to that point about the trauma dumping versus giving value.
Yeah.
So when we think about storytelling, one of the concepts in storytelling is something called juxtaposition, which basically just means contrast between two things, right?
Ooh, okay.
So a lot of times when people think about what's the saddest movie you saw as a kid or growing up, or what are the movies that people think of that are really emotionally resonant, for me, like as a kid, it was like The Lion King, right? And like Mufasa dies, Simba's father dies. That's a moment that stuck out in a lot of 90s kids' brains.
Yeah.
But if you go watch that movie, about 5% of the movie is actually like dour, sad. Very small percentage of it. But that moment hits so hard because the 30 minutes that lead up to it are really happy and positive and optimistic, right?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of danger in there, but mostly positive, being a kid, being optimistic, being, hopeful.
Yeah.
And then so when tragedy strikes, it hits that much harder.
Yeah,
right? It's that
it's
much
the Lion
more
King or Bambi, where you're like,
any of those. That's the gut punch, right?
Yeah. How dare they? We're still mad about it.
Exactly.
We're still mad about it.
How dare they? But that is exactly the response you want. So whenever you go there, whenever you have that emotional moment, your audience has that how dare they? You know what I mean? Moment where they have grown to care about the subject, the storyteller, you, the creator. And then when you share that, it's that much more like, man, like this creator that I really care about has really been through some things, and they've been helping me, and they've been putting it aside for so long and just giving value. And then whenever you do share that story, it's going to be a lot more impactful. Everybody's life is not hopeful and optimistic all of the time. And I'm not asking for people to be, fake happy or fake nice or toxically positive. Right. But I'm not, the ratio is up to you, right? The ratio is up to you. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you want to save those moments. You want to save those moments. If I'm just constantly punching you in the gut, eventually you go numb.
Yeah.
Right. And you start anticipating it and you start recoiling. Right.
People mute your account. They just do. Exactly. They're like, I don't want to unfollow them, but they mute you. So, okay, hold on. We got to pause and talk about this, because we've also seen this with people with storytelling, where it's always just happy all the time, and you're just like, that's fake. Like, again, it goes both ways, where it's the both extremes. It could also be the movie that we watch and we're just like, get to the point of the plot.
Yes.
We could see that, where it's like, if you're posting your food all the time, nothing's wrong with that. But if you're then coming in with a hard punch, you're just like, whoa, there was no setup there. Like, Whiplash. This came out of left field. Like, and that's something that, somebody was like, you should do, basically treat, if you're wanting to share your social media, like share your story on social media, one of the things to consider is like, it's kind of like selling on social media. You don't want to sell to the person a bunch. You don't want to be like gut punch, gut punch, gut punch, like come buy from me. Same thing with sharing your story, both happy and bad. Is like you want people to relate to you. So what are you building? Are you building a following or are you building a community? And like if you're sharing your story online, you're building a community. So that I think being able to see it that way has really shifted me to be like, okay, what can I do? Not just to be like, oh, here's my story, but like share your story with me. Like, how can I pray with you? How can I uplift you today? Like, how can I be there in your corner? So I answer every single message that comes in. I comment back to every comment that comes in, even negative, because I'm like, hey, someone's reading your negative comment and applying it to their life, and they need to know what the truth is right here.
Yeah.
But I think that really shifted storytelling for me. Was it goes both ways of both bad and good. How are we sharing that? But also, how are we building the community aspect through our social platforms?
Totally. And I think it's also, I want to make clear, it's not always a one or the other. There's also opportunities to kind of merge these things and inject humor. Like, I'll give you an example.
I try my best, Daniel.
I have kind of a dark sense of humor. And so I live here in Atlanta, and we recently had a chemical plant explode like 10 minutes from my house. And so there's like this big chlorine gas cloud that was like hanging over Atlanta, and it was like, stay inside, bring dogs in, bring kids in, shut the AC off. Like, it was
pee on the floor, it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. It was this big, like, oh my God, like thing we didn't know. Turned out to be fun, but we didn't know.
Okay, yeah.
But I opened my phone, and one of my friends had posted like a fake ad for a chlorine gas spill party where we were going to go outside in the chlorine gas cloud and like wear hazmat suits and dance around the fire. Like, and it was like, I was like dying laughing because it was cathartic, because we were worried. We were worried like, that this was going to be a big problem. I think there's in the right moments and the right opportunities, there's ways to inject levity and gallows humor if that's your jam. Not to make light of an issue necessarily, but to sort of share in it.
And to give a fresh breath of air. It's what it is.
And I think it brings people in. It lets people go. Because I think one of the big things on social is everyone's like, God, people are so serious. Like, everything is so serious.
Everything. You're just like, how did that get turned into being like, my favorite ice cream is vanilla. How dare you? You hate all other ice cream. I'm like, this really happened.
When you can make a joke, when you can use satire, when you can make a joke, not only does the point often seep in, again, honey with the medicine thing, right? It also brings people in and helps build that community, because they're like, I can be a part of this too. I can laugh a little bit. I can, I can be a little light. I don't have to be so serious and dour about this. And again, balancing act. Not saying make light of trauma. It's just about finding
let's say this. Hold on. Everyone who's experienced trauma, we're with you. Like, if you saw our memes that we send to each other, it's the only way to make something very heavy and serious. We need that laugh. And it's not that we're making fun of trauma. It's not we're making fun. Like, we're not going around being like, you should be hurt. But it's just like, you hear most people who go through something hard, they're just like, and then the normal person is just like, oh my God. But everyone else in the room who's experienced trauma is like, that is so funny, because we're just like, dude, this is too heavy. And it's so funny, because if you saw my, like, half my friends who were all on the advocacy side for foster care communities and foster parents and stuff, like, if you saw all the memes we send to each other, you'd be like, yeah, satire exists. We're not making fun of trauma. We're just we're trying to have a breath of fresh air, because this is heavy.
Totally.
And that's what it's for. That's what satire's for.
Yes.
It's like that in social media.
It's very effective, especially on social media. I mean, I mean, pretty much all the accounts I follow are in that realm of like satirical, but also sprinkled in with some like social, some seriousness and some education. Those are the accounts that really, really stick.
Yeah. There's this one lady, I don't know who she is, but she always like just yells when she takes trends and then she makes them to where like, I'm not this, I'm not that. You're just like, who are you? I want to be your friend because I just need you to yell in a serious moment of like, this is not me. But I think that's so, it's just so needed sometimes, is that with, you know, we could put some humor into it. And I've seen some people do that with like trauma accounts where it's just like, oh, it feels like, you know, trauma feels like running into a brick wall. It's like, why would you run into a brick wall? It's like, exactly. Like, nobody wants to run into a wall, aka nobody wants trauma. Like, and I'm like, hey, that's a valid point. But if we don't find our way of telling our story and we try to copycat everybody else, that's where we'll never feel authentically us in our story. And I think that that's where the collaboration piece you talked about really comes into play, because we learn to take feedback from other people versus being so offended. Because like you said earlier when we started, is telling our story is one of the hardest things to tell. But when we're in collaboration with people, we start to learn to take feedback, and we start to learn that like them saying, hey, I don't really understand this part, or I don't like this part, is not a ding at you not being good enough. And I think that when someone has experienced trauma, that is the hardest thing with storytelling, is like, I'm going to be honest, that is me. Every time I'm like, you don't like my stuff, you don't like me, I'm not worthy.
It's
and
hard.
It's like, pause. They're just saying they didn't like how you verbalized this. And it's not because it's not good, it's that they didn't understand what you were trying to get at. So being in collaboration can be scary. So what are ways that we can reframe what collaboration can be for us?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. This is something that I have struggled with for my entire creative career.
Same.
And
it's hard.
Getting better, but it's still not all the way there. I think for me, especially earlier in my career and still today, but like I made a lot of work that was really personal, right? That felt like it came from the heart. Like this was me up there. And that's a lot of what you're doing and a lot of what your audience is trying to do, right? So the advice that I would give you that was given to me by a colleague was, hey man, I'm not criticizing you. I'm not criticizing you as a human or your story or your feelings. I'm just criticizing the work, right? And so you have to build a wall between those two things. You need a healthy boundary, and that takes time. I'm gonna tell you now. That takes time. You need a healthy wall. That's like, okay, this is the craft. This is the content. This is the creation, and this is my life story or my emotions that I put into this. Right? Those are two things. You need to be able to like lob it over the wall to one another, but they can't clash, because if they clash too much, what you'll find is you'll start taking some of that criticism as personal attacks, right? When it's like, no, that's not what's happening here. And I've lashed out at people like that I shouldn't have, because like they were criticizing the work. Yeah. And I was like, and it wasn't good. Like ultimately I scrapped it. They were right.
And you look back at it. So, but dig into that a little bit, because I heard a phrase from someone who said, and this is like the last year I have to remind myself, she has said, you are not getting rejected. What you have to offer is getting rejected, because maybe it needs to be revamped. And I was like, huh. But how do you, because I know how I tell myself is very probably different than you would tell yourself, like, but how did you start telling yourself like, hey, let's pass the ball to the other side, and like it's the offer that they're rejecting, it's the thing I put out, without looking at it and being like, take a bat to the room emotionally and be like, screw you all, because that ruins relationships.
It does, but I also think it's part of the process. I also think
that's true.
I mean, my opinion on this is, at least just from my point of view, is just that, like, hey man, that's okay. That means you care. Like if you're a young upstart creative just getting started in your storytelling journey, and you have that reaction, I'll probably roll my eyes, but I'll be like, they actually give a shit. Can I curse on here? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm a sailor.
But I was like, they actually care about this work.
Yeah.
Like, so, and for me, it was just reps. It just had to get whittled down in me over time, and also getting older, maturing, you know, that helps a lot too. I think so. that would be my opinion, is like,
I love that.
just trust like I said, trust the process.
Yeah.
Trust the
My
process.
I love that.
Accept it's going to be painful for a little while,
Yeah.
but that it will get better.
My husband has said, because like, so with my first book, he's like, it wasn't very good. And I was like, how dare you? But then I'm like, no, you're right.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
okay. It was okay. But it got me into the writing. But the way that my husband always puts it is, one of the, and he's not rude in his approach at all, but it's very much like, if I can give you this feedback and you receive it, it is
Right.
a lot better that it's someone you trust and know
Yes.
versus someone that's
Yes.
100-fold, like 100 different people being like, this is the worst idea I've ever seen. This is horrible. This is crap. And then it not let you into the next opportunity.
Yeah.
But he always
Yeah.
relates it back to like, American Idol, The Voice, where it's like, you don't want to be the friend of the person who cannot sing, who's on this show, and they're like, I'm the best thing ever. And it's like, if someone just told you the truth,
Right.
you could have
Right.
maybe made it better, maybe gone voice lessons, like whatever it might have been, or maybe you wouldn't have auditioned and embarrassed yourself until you were ready, like really ready. And that's where, like, I keep telling my husband, like, I'm like, this book that I'm writing, like, I feel like this is gonna be good, but I'm also like being very critical of like, okay, what am I putting out there, because I want it to be good. I don't want to just be like, it's good because of it's a concept. Like, I want it to be good because what I want is for someone to get it and go, I learned something from this. Not,
Yeah.
I got it and I was asking for more, or I noticed a lot of spelling and grammar issues. I noticed a lot of things, like it just didn't clarify a lot of things for me. Like, this wasn't a thought out paragraph. And I'm like, I want to spend the time to do that. And that is the hardest thing for me, is to spend the time doing it. I'll execute things real quick and be like, cool, 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 cool. And then I'm like, I could have done that a lot differently. That's how I learn. But with this book is a little bit different, because it is talking, the title of the book is Taking My Voice Back, Healing What Broke Me. And that concept is like, well, how do I help other people do that? It's not about airing my laundry. It's not about just being like, well, I'm so good, I've gone through healing. It's like, okay, if someone was to read this, I want them to picture themselves in this as well, to say, okay, healing is possible. I can get my voice back out of this. I can learn how to start doing that, and maybe understand why it's been so scary to share my story or share what I feel. That's my hope from that. But if I don't sit back and say, okay, what's the hope of this that I'm posting or pushing out there, I'm not going to really know if it's going to land properly, because there's no, that's where script writing can come in. And that's where collaboration and feedback can come in, where they're like, hey, you kind of missed the mark here. Not, you're a horrible person, why did you tell your story? That was so dumb. Like, no. Just like, hey, I'm not tracking what you're trying to say. And I'm like, oh, that's a very different way to look at it, is that they're not tracking with me. And even though my heart is in it, maybe the layout is just missing. And by getting that feedback, I can go and implement it, or choose to scrap it and be like, that's not a great idea. It's just not. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
That's a great mindset. That's a great perspective. I always find in my work, I like to start from the end state, right? How do I want people to feel when they walk away from this?
Yeah.
What action do we want people to take? Like, what is the goal?
Yes,
what is the end goal? And then
yeah.
let's work backwards and try to create something conceptually that might work towards that goal. So, because if you have this kind of North Star that you're aiming at, especially if you're doing something longer form like a book, which is a long form project, a large undertaking.
It is large.
Or a film.
It's over 100 films. Yes. So long.
Years and years of our lives dedicated to these projects. Right?
The editing process, man.
Yeah, all of it. If you have that kind of North Star, then like whenever you get stuck, or whenever you're not sure, or whenever you're trying to overcome a challenge, you always know like this is where we're headed, right?
Yeah.
And that can really help you overcome challenges. And especially to your point, if you're building a team and you're working with a team, if you're collaborating, now there's a shared vision.
Yeah.
Now everyone, and then I can say, you can say to me, hey, you're off vision. Like that's not the vision, right?
And it's not offensive, because it's just you're off vision.
It's just like, well, you're right. It is off vision. Or, hey, well, it was off vision, but now we have new information. So maybe the vision should change, right?
Yeah.
But when you have that kind of core like I said, kind of North Star, kind of core concept vision that you're aiming for, it takes the personality out of it. It takes the personal attacks out of it, and it
Yeah.
makes it much more, for lack of, not transactional, but it makes it more tangible. Makes
Yeah.
it more tangible what you're trying to get to. That's always been a really helpful
I love that. And
method in my work.
I think if you're not wanting to put something so personal, and this is going to sound so silly, but if you're like, okay, I know I can't put anything personally out there, start taking
Right.
a class where a professor provides feedback. Because then,
Yes.
like, even when it's not super personal and you're still getting hurt, it really, what it comes down to, at least for me, I'm going to just speak for myself because I'm not going to speak for anybody else.
Right.
When I have found that I have felt wounded was because I felt like what the rejection was me not being good enough. And I'd be like, I
Yeah.
don't know how I missed the mark. And my professor was trying to tell me how I missed the mark, but I was offended because it was something that I was like, I just want someone to look at me and say that I have value. You have value even
Truth.
when you don't tell your story the way you want. You have value even
Truth.
when you're not putting your story out there. You still have value when you get rejected for your idea, because you're not getting rejected as you're getting rejected for what you're offering. If you can separate those two things, like, that has been the biggest change for me. I do a lot of I throw myself out there a lot for my business. I coach doctoral students, and then I coach people to how to share their stories. But I go out and put my name in the hat for speaking events all the time. Sometimes I'd get ghosted, like people don't even respond. But I'll have to send 250 emails just to get a couple responses back. And people are like, how do you do that? How do you go and get people on your podcast and not fear rejection? I'm like, oh, I send it and I'm fearing rejection. I'm like, oh, want to be on my podcast? And I'm like, they're going to say no. But I'm sitting there and I'm
Right.
like, okay, they're going to, okay. And I'm still fine. But if I can go and do something simple for now, is take a class, get that feedback from someone, that, again, that's starting, like you said earlier, it's starting to strengthen that muscle to say feedback is not dangerous. But we have often, especially with people, I think, who experience trauma or maybe self-esteem is a little bit low, rejection feels like everything. And it's not when you're able to separate and say, okay, I'm going to get rejected, but let's see if this might be the yes that I get. And if it's a not yet, there's no real thing as no. It's just not yet. If you work on it,
Right.
if
Right.
you work on it and
Yeah.
develop that muscle.
Totally. And I love that you just said that. I think a lot of it stems from imposter syndrome.
That thing is a
which
nasty
a lot of us,
monster. We don't like
it
that.
really is. No, it's not good. And I think a lot of people enter the creative space maybe because they deal with that.
Yeah.
They have that tendency. I know I did. I'm
Oh, I
saying
still
from
do.
personal experience. Like, what I mean is, like, I think it fueled me to enter the creative space.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it actually
I could see that,
is
yeah.
what pushed me in this direction.
Yeah.
So there's there's that aspect to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and also the other thing, to echo your point, I teach a class to young creatives and early 20s, college age students. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, last semester, I had a student, very talented, very
Mm.
creative. She was awesome, but could not take feedback at all.
That's
And
hard.
like, to the point of like, I'm going to get up and walk out of here if you guys don't like this work.
Give me the
And
A.
like,
I'm like, no.
yeah. But right.
You have
No.
to earn it.
And it was challenging. I wish I had had this conversation during that class at some point, because it would have made me realize this consciously. But what ultimately ends up happening, unfortunately, is people start to shut off.
Yeah.
And eventually what happens
They
is
give
just like,
up. They quit.
I don't want to
Yeah.
be in conflict. Yeah, I don't want to be in conflict with you every time we have to go over something.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna kind of just like be like, I'm
Yeah,
not gonna
I'm
give you
gonna
the
push.
real deal,
Yeah,
because
I'm gonna move
I'm
you.
gonna just
Yeah.
move on, because I have a lot of people to give feedback to, and I can't be in conflict every
Every single time. Well, and
every single
this
time.
also happens in our jobs. Like, it's not
Yeah.
just when we're working on something personal,
Yes.
but I recognize that this was bleeding into where I was working. I hate year reviews. They're the death of me. Like, I'm like, I think I'm doing so good. And they're like, you got 2s across the board. And I'm like, what do you mean I didn't get 5s? Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, rude. But it made me, like, I look back at it now and sometimes I just like chuckle at myself, but I'm like really grateful for the growth. But I
Mhm.
would not have experienced the growth if I didn't step out as an entrepreneur, because it was like
Yes.
I had to daily be rejected. And there were times in the beginning of my journey of starting my business and putting my name out there, people would be like, sorry, I'm choosing somebody else as a coach. And I was like,
How dare you?
but you best believe anytime I put my name in the hat for being like to a literary agent and they say no, you best believe I'm crying, because it's just like, dang it. And normally it's not me crying because I'm like, they rejected me. It's more of like, I didn't even get any feedback, so I don't even know what to improve, but I really
Yeah.
believe in this message. And
Yeah.
this time around, I'm like, I can self-publish this because I think it's good enough. I don't need the feedback as much from someone who's like, well, we want this and that in there. We want your details of your story. Cause I'm like, I don't want that in this book. I don't want that trauma in this book as
Right.
that. So I want to be able to allude to it, but not go in depth with it, which will happen
Right.
if I'm signed somewhere. But I've been able to sit back and say, okay, can I ask a couple people to read through this and give me feedback? And every time I'm like, hey, would you mind reading this? I'm like, oh god, it's gonna this and I'm like, be kind in your feedback, please be accurate, but like challenge me a little bit. But I really have to, that I still struggle with that, because it's still, I believe in what I'm putting out there, but I'm having to say, they're not attacking me or my story or the way that I'm sharing this. What they are doing is helping me make this better. And I mean, I went through a dissertation and my chair did that and my methodologist did that, where they attacked my chapters every single time. And like,
Right.
when anything is red on a paper, I'm like, it's the ultimate rejection. And it could literally, one time my chair was like, good job, and her comment, and I was like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh, it says
It's a
good
trigger.
job. It was just the red mark made me go, oh my god, I failed. But that's where I think that kind of helped me a little bit more in this process, to be like, feedback is so good because it makes what we were delivering better. But it sometimes is that moment where we're like, oh, this is not as good as I thought it was, and then now I don't know how to revamp this, so I'm going to scrap it. And I have 100 book ideas. I've published 2. like, because they're not all that I really believe in. That it's more of like, oh, I could make this a social media post instead, and that's okay.
Right.
But it is hard to receive feedback sometimes, and I want people to hear, like, we all still struggle with that. We're learning to view feedback differently. So do you have anything else you would like to add before we close out?
I think the last thing I want to just kind of add to your point here, about feedback, and I love that so much of this conversation is centered around that, because it's such it's one of those things that we don't really talk about in the creative space. It's always about tech or whatever.
You're like, get this camera, get that thing, get this thing.
Yeah.
I was like, I need more about the real.
This is so important.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the real deal, right? The process. There's also like something to be said for how much do you care about those publishers' notes and feedback, because that's subjective, right?
Yeah.
Their notes are 100% subjective. They want to see what they want to see, for their own reasons, right? I think the reason the new media thing is so exciting to me is we get a lot more authentic voices.
Yes.
We get a lot more people just saying what they want to say, how they want to say it. Yes, you should still understand the process, understand craft.
Yeah.
Education is still all very important. Doesn't mean just throw it out there and be done with it. But what it means is you don't have some guy in a suit sitting across from you going, no, X mark, push it away, right? That's not valuable to the creative community. It's not valuable to the advocacy community.
Right.
There may be a place for it at some point in your career or another's career to scale, right?
Right.
But when you're honing your craft and whenever you're trying to tell your story authentically, I would say to those out there, to your audience, don't let people tell you this is no good. Like, they're going to tell you this is no good. That's just their opinion.
Yeah.
That's just one opinion, and it's not the be all end all.
Yeah.
Like it's how much weight do you even want to give someone's opinion who hasn't lived your experiences, or
Right.
hasn't even doesn't even care,
Yeah.
right?
Well, they don't, because they've just let it
So
pass through. But that's really valid, because if you have 5 people looking at it and they're all saying like, "Hey, I'm not understanding the concept. Like you said, you were going left, but it's really going right. Like, what if you align this?" That's different. But for
that's
someone who
valuable.
comes
Yes.
in and goes, "Well, this is what I hear all the time is, oh, I would like to see more of your trauma. Like, I want to see you detail out what happened to you." You could go, "No." But
Right.
that's not like, "Oh, well, I'm never going to make it if I don't tell my trauma." But that's such a valid thing to really, like, it. When you talked to them one time, you didn't even talk to them, you emailed them. Like, that's valid.
Right.
Like, I love that. Anything else you want to add before we end?
That's all I got.
I love it.
I appreciate you having me. This was a
Yeah,
blast.
I love it. I'm so excited. I'm really excited for people to really understand the concept of positive feedback that helps us grow. Sometimes it doesn't look
Yes.
positive. Sometimes
Yeah.
it feels negative. But I really
Yes.
love that you said separate, like kind of like throwing a ball over a wall. Like, here's me, here's my idea. I'm going to pass it back and
Right.
forth versus be so entwined with
Yes.
it. You guys follow
Yes.
Daniel. He's amazing. Ask him all the questions that you need to ask. Follow him on LinkedIn. He's a celebrity now. And then we'll keep going with our conversations. Thank you so much, Daniel. This was a blast. Have a great day, everybody. I always let it give a second. It's still recording, I think. That's fine. Awesome. So just have it open
Awesome.
just for a little
Great.
bit. And then if you have any questions, let me know. But thank you so much for joining. This was great. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you. Would you mind if I took some of these video clips and just chop
Absolutely.
them up,
So
throw them on
I
LinkedIn?
will absolutely. You have free reign. So I'll post it
Awesome.
on next week. So it'll go live
Mhm.
sometime next.
Um, hmm. Yeah. Yes, I do. I do have Opus. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was so much fun. Take care. Bye bye.